Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm continuing my lecture series into theories of ethnicity and nationalism. We are on section 2.0. This is in my notes. You can find, well, you have to pardon, these are notes for myself, but you'll have to pardon that. But if you want to access the notes, just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download the PDF, use it to supplement your reading. The reading today is from Ethnicity versus Nationalism out of the Journal of Peace and Research. I think I used the same journal article for the last section. Yeah, I did. So, same journal article. You can use that, download it, read it, and use it to supplement your understanding. So let's begin. And this is section 2.0. Alright, so two main threats to nationalism, right? The idea are, there are, obviously, to any nation, there are potential saboteurs, usurpers, two main threats that arise within the context of nationalism, and we'll see sort of how this unravels in a bit. Let me just get a sip, and then we'll begin. Alright, so we have agents of subversion. So number one, so these are threats. And number one, we have subversion, agents of subversion. And we have individual saboteurs, relatively easily to contain, and ethnical saboteurs. Necessitates a genocidal campaign. Okay, so you think about the idea of sabotage or saboteurs, and we have two real macro level sort of concepts, even though it pertains to the individual. We have the individual saboteur, and then we have the collective. Oops, sorry about that. Alright, so the collective, ethnical, and the individual. The idea is, the attempt is to infiltrate and usurp the power of the nation, which is easier said than done. It's actually incredibly difficult. However, it happens several times a millennia, plenty of times throughout the millennia. You'll have nations come and go, rise and fall to power relatively quickly. Some nations stick around for a while. The nation is the same in terms of its founding, its name, the divisions and state and such, blah blah blah. But nations change as well, right? And this is the potential threat. This is the potential hostility. Is the power from external forces to either completely dismantle the nation via revolution at its most extreme sense, or civil war at its most extreme sense, or probably the more likely, the gradual transformation, the gradual change, such that it's not a wholesale destruction, but more of an erosion of the original concept. As we know, the nation is defined by its symbols, its concepts, and its ideologies. And it's a transformation of that, the gradual transformation of the symbols, the gradual transformation of the ideology, the gradual transformation of the interest of the concept that the nation was founded on, the principles that it has. So all of these are more likely. It's more likely that things happen in this way, and it can be any number of reasons. In terms of the article, with reference specifically to the reading, we're talking about with the intent to sabotage, right? With the intent to undermine national interests. So the individual, which is sort of easy to explain, and you're talking about the individual saboteur. The individual might justify his or her actions as just. I don't want to really give examples because anytime you give and this is an important point, right? Anytime you give an example, obviously, saboteur has a bit of a pejorative, not necessarily, but has a pejorative sort of connotation. It's important to recognize that, well, one person's saboteur is another person's hero, right? One person's villain is another person's good guy. But you get the idea. The individual person who infiltrates some, macro level national system and seeks to undermine its interests. Really, really hard to pull off. I mean, I guess I do have to give an example. Like, you think about like a Snowden, but the nation, while its secrets have been exposed, is still very much intact. It's difficult for an individual, though this will likely change in the next 50, 100 years. This will likely change with advances in computer technology and a better understanding of really what computers are capable of doing. And it will only be able to do, computers will only be able to do more and more and more as the generations pass. It could potentially be the case that an individual person could undermine the nation itself, could collapse a nation itself. That's way more science fiction now than fact. I don't see that being science fact for a century, if not. Why? Because of any number of internal security systems in place to protect from stuff like that. It's not easy to do it. However, you can imagine a collective grouping of individuals. That really could happen, right? You could, for all practical purposes, strong-arm your position. You could put yourself in a position to be negotiated with, to be feared, to be respected, to be identified, to be acknowledged, what have you. To take, imagine a collective grouping of people having that power. For sure, that could happen. And best case interests, there's a negotiation of power. Worst case interests, there's the attempt to usurp power. And what happens, and I do genocide studies professionally. I've written on it and read it and actively teach on the topic. If the nation identifies not the individual, which is a bit harder to do, at least previously, but the group, a collective grouping, these ethnical people, as the potential threat, such that the threat is articulated wholly within the context of the ethnical character of the group, well, you have to recognize that every member of that group is going to be, every ethnical person affiliated with that group, not just those within the group that seek to usurp the power of the state, but every member of that group becomes a potential threat. And in interest to protect its sovereignty, in interest to protect its power, justly or not, how that power came to be, genocide ends up becoming a very feasible means of securing power, and obviously that is unjust. So, very general sort of concept of the threat. The threat can be individual or collective. That collective threat can be defined in terms of its ethnical identification. Insofar as that collective threat is identified in its ethnical identification, every individual of that ethnicity is at stake. And this has happened in the United States, unfortunately. It didn't get genocidal, but the internment of Japanese Americans after the Second World War, I mean, there's no question about it, right? The United States of America interned, created camps for specifically Japanese Americans because of the threat that this collective ethnical population posed, and it was threatened in quotes, right? It was, just a quick side note, the quotes, I think people are misusing quotes now. I see people using quotes to mean emphasis, like italics. Quotes are when we're talking about something that's paradoxical. It's alleged to be the case, but it's not something like that. So just general side note, having nothing at all to do with this lecture series, please make sure that you understand what the appropriate use of quotes before you use them. It looks ridiculous now. Everybody putting words in quotes, and it's not supposed to be. It's obscene. This is quotes, though, right? It's the threat that they posed. The reason is because they didn't pose a threat other than being Japanese, and there were American citizens in that. So don't think that our government, I'm always up here. I thought about this today on my drive to work this morning, and I was like, a lot of my lecture series, especially this series in Nationalism, it sounds very, very heavily propagandist almost. It's like, yay, America. And I am yay America, but the truth of the matter is America is not beyond doing some really grimy stuff. America has done some really evil stuff to its people. It's likely that America will continue to do really evil stuff. stuff to its people. So you shouldn't stand here, I'm not going to stand here and say, yeah, America, every single time, it's unblemished. No. We need activists, we need people who are concerned with rights, we need people who are concerned with civil liberties, we need people to fight the system when the system oversteps its bounds. And it's typically been the case, historically, that the bounds have been overstepped with the collective grouping. So, as an example, the internment of Japanese Americans post-World War. It was a blemish, and it will forever remain a blemish on America. Granted, America has moved on since then. Reparations, I think, under Clinton, were enacted. If I'm not mistaken, I didn't really prep to that level. This is just sort of knowledge that I've gathered over the years. So the collective grouping is obvious, and historically, the collective grouping, the ethnical population, has been the target for the nation's capability to overstep its power. I don't think it's going to be the collective grouping, the collective ethnical grouping anymore. I think what we've seen with stuff like the Patriot Act and PRISM and such is the potential for the state and the nation to overstep its boundaries, just like it did with, think about how atrocious it must have been for Japanese Americans who experienced that phenomenon right after the Nazis did, barring the executions, but at least the rounding up, right after the Nazis did this to Jews and to others in Europe. Imagine the horror of being that weak to the power of the nation, knowing what other nations have been doing to their citizens, and then have your country, the United States of America, say, you need to go into this protective place, which looks just like other camps that you've been hearing about, but trust us, we won't do you harm, right? Think about the horror that must have caused for families, right? If you think that the nation, the United States of America, is incapable of repeating exactly the same thing, but not in terms of the collective now, but in terms of what they believe to be individual saboteurs, well, I mean, you're sadly mistaken. You don't really know your history that well. And that has to do, I'm not going to go off into a tangent on this, but it has to do with the belief of what we're having right now, the current debate that we're having as a consequence of some of the stuff that Snowden leaked, right? I tend to be more sort of structured and top-down sort of focused. That's my approach. Whether it's good or bad, doesn't really matter. Everybody needs to have a side. You can go bottom-up, grassroots, you can go top-down. I go top-down, so I can see how these systems could be used to do good. I also recognize, undeniably, that it's a guy and a chick on the back end of that keyboard. And as Biggie says, niggas bleed just like me. Picture me being scared of a nigga that breathes the same air as me. Independent to the nation, it's people on the other side of all of this technology. So the idea is individual people can abuse the position and undermine the power of the sovereign, undermine the power of the nation before, in order to get collective mobilization from an ethnical population. You would imagine it would be, I mean, of course, this decision comes from the very top. And it's hierarchically ranked all the way down to the bottom. What's really scary in a contemporary sense is you got, 16, 17-year-old, 22-year-old pimple-faced Worlds of Warcraft playing Yahoo jokers calling themselves working for the United States government, and they want to get around and play games with people's lives. Yeah, that could be real problematic. That could be problematic for the individual people and the individuals who are having their privacy and their rights abused and sort of just gameplay for the fun of gameplay. But to the nation, to let the nation know that everybody ain't going to bow down. You know what I'm saying? People ain't going to bow down. That's not going to be, we always ready. We were always ready. So once this power, and if this power is going to, if it collects to the point where it's like, oh, well, we're going to start herding you up and putting you in internment camps like we did with the Japanese Americans, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's see how long this lasts. If you continue down this trajectory, let's see how long this lasts. That is the nation. And I want to put United States of America in check in this series, because I don't want to go down as, oh, Jason was just the propagandist. Oh, Jason was just the one who was so in love. All of his lectures, you watch his stuff, all he talks about is, yay, America, yay, America. No, it's not always yay, America. America's been known to do some really grimy shit. And the idea is there needs to be a respect for people's individual rights, because some of us know it's a nigga just like me Well, not just like me. I mean, you would have to be a pretty amazing nigga. And I know this is going up to the internet, and I'm not apologizing for that. It's just people just like me on the other side of that computer. So behind all the facade and all the power and all the scare tactics and all of that that's implemented, it's a nigga or a chick just like me. And the truth of the matter is, eventually American people are going to wake up and realize that, wow, you know, there's egregious offenses that are being had by the name of quote unquote national security, whatever that might mean. And these offenses are interfering with the productivity of, you know, average mom and dad citizens. So don't think for a second that I'm sitting up here being a propagandist for the United States and this it can't do no wrong. That's absolutely not the case. The United States of America has systematically violated the rights of its citizens habitually. Now there is an opportunity to violate the rights of its citizens, not collectively in terms of ethnical populations, but they can pick you out in your home. And to think that, you know, the person on the end of that computer, on the other side of that, is going to be a nice moral person and act and use all that power that they've been given via the internet and via computer and via, you know, the Patriot Act's sort of open door policy to complete invasion of privacy, that they're gonna act right. I'm here to tell you that they won't. No, you know, boundaries will be stepped across, right? And that's just how it is. You know, that's how it is. The consequences of this, we'll wait and see. But do believe that it could potentially get as bad as it already had been. It's important that people wake up and recognize that the belief in this saboteur, the belief in those who seek to undermine the collective might of the nation, has habitually been used as an excuse to invade people's privacy, to kill people en masse. And the idea that somehow that would just stop overnight is laughable. Is laughable at best, right? So that's the first part, right? The agents of subversion. Number two, agents of fission, right? So we have agents of subversion, and then we have agents of fission. So the individual agent, it's nearly, this is on 21 and 22, it's nearly impossible to, accomplish, right? So let me do both of them, and then I want to read the quote on page 22 so that I can explain this in a way that you guys can understand. So let's go to 22 before I do the explanation of 2. So 22, ethnical agents, obviously, hugely problematic, almost certainly devout ideologists and such, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. So here's the quote. Quote, nationalists, this is the top of page 22, nationalists' strategies are truly successful only when the state simultaneously increases its sphere of influence and responds credibly to popular demands, right? When it increases its sphere of influence, right, what the nation is able to influence, increases its sphere of influence, and also responds to the demands of the people. Now, the problem being the people need to voice their demands. I mean, that's obvious, right? Without voicing your demands, you can't really be upset with the nation. Similarly, you know, if Christmas time is coming and if my kids want a particular toy, if they don't tell me that they want the toy, then they can't be upset with me that I never got them the toy. It's important to make your voices, your demands heard so that the nation knows how to respond appropriately to the demands of the people. So in terms of within the context of what's been happening with, you know, WikiLeaks and Snowden and Assange and all that other stuff, the idea is we need more people to make their voices heard so that the nation can properly address the needs of the people. However, if it's the case that you make your voices heard, like I just did in the last, 20 minutes of the video, if it's the case that I say, no, I'm not going to be up here and be a propagandist and be like, yeah, America all the time, because I'm too educated and I've had too much life experience to know that that's always the case, right? There's a certain acceptable bounds that you're allowed to take. If it's the case that I say what I say, and then it's, oh, well, retribution for Jason, well, fuck it, retribution for Jason. But you can't sit around, you as the individual person, you as a citizen, we as citizens of any nation, of not just the United States, of any nation, we have to say it. We have to say it. It's not cool. It's not cool, right? It's not cool to give individuals the amount of power that they have contemporarily in terms of an alleged surveillance for national security, interests as a sweep-all generalization, and then to have these peon-ass analysts and these peon-ass freaking computer people jump on computers and play stupid-ass games with people's lives, like they really doing shit, like you really protect. That's going to undermine national interest, because it's a lot of people who are interested in serving the nation who have tremendous talent. And trust me, people will leave in horde from the United States of America if that becomes the new norm. And the United States of America takes retribution, starts killing people, and then what happens to national interest, right? Well, it's not going to go any higher, I can tell you. There's only one place for it to go, and it's pfft. So the idea is, in terms of those demands need to be made by the people, young people especially, young. Now, if they don't, that's their problem. Don't complain, right? But you only ever have a right to make fuss, to mobilize in defense of yourself and your beliefs and your ideals and your community and your people, if you've made those demands made repeatedly and the nation just refuses to accept. And if those demands are something like, please respect, my privacy, please respect the dignity of my fucking family, please respect the dignity of my community, and the nation doesn't acknowledge that, then what is it? Then we playing a different type of game then, right? Then we playing a different type of game. So that the idea is it's important for people to stand up. You got to stand up, because if left unchecked, if nobody says anything, if the people allow the government to continue, then you better believe that your privacy, your family, your rights, the people that you love, none of that means anything. Because at the end of the day, it's about power and power only. And that's the dark side of it. Right? So it's important to recognize how essential it is to both protect the nation from actual agents of sabotage, actual agents of division, force, strife, agents who seek to undermine, implode national interests, who seek to exacerbate conflict unnecessarily and such. And the need for surveillance of these people and detainment and such, right? Yes, that needs to be had. But on the other hand, it can't just be the case that because there is the technological ability to do such, that you have a free-for-all with people's private lives, right? That's not going to last. That's not going to last. And like I always say, it's important not to say something. It's not about what you say. It's not about what you say. The good thing about epistemology is a real painful thing if you learn to live epistemically. Put yourself in a position to be exploited and see if you are exploited. Don't tell me about national interest. Don't tell me about the care and the love. Don't tell me that. Don't tell me that. Anybody can say that. You can imagine a domestic abuse case, and it seems like I'm on a tangent, but I'm not. You can imagine a domestic abuse case where the husband slaps the wife. Wah, pow! And he feels bad, and he's like, oh, I'm sorry, baby, I love you. She's like, okay, I forgive you. Wah, pow! Oh, I'm sorry, baby, I love you. Oh, okay, I forgive you. Yeah, is that really love, though? That's what love is, right? Love is the ability to consistently beg for forgiveness while consistently abusing the person you're said to love. Is that what that is? The unfortunate point of this is maybe 300-400 of you in the entire U.S. population watch these videos, which is exactly how I want it. I don't want my videos to be freaking viral and everybody watching my crap. That's why I make it boring as hell. That's why I have notes. That's why it's lecture style. That's why there's a marker and a board and I get dressed up. That's why I do this, because I don't want this to be for the mass, because the mass isn't ready for this. It requires a lot of attention. It requires dedication and patience to sit through 15 hours plus of lecture. But the truth is if you are one of the 400 people or 500 people who has stuck it out through the 9 other sections to get to this point. You're the type of person that I'm working for. There's something about you that I really do love. I can't talk about anybody else's love, but I can say that I really do love. Because don't think I'm doing this for the money. I'm not. Don't think I'm doing this because I need to secure my job. I don't need to. Don't think that I'm doing this for any self-interest. I'm doing this so that this next generation of scholars and thinkers and deans and presidents of universities and critical theorists and journal editors and journal writers and book writers, you, the next generation of intellects, that I will have a hand in shaping how you interpret the world. I will have a hand in helping you understand prior to you coming, arriving full force in your sort of established intellect. That's a huge responsibility, and I want to contribute as much as I can. You're the type of person that can recognize systemic injustice. You're the type of person that can recognize abuses of authority. You're the type of person that has the patience to sit down and recognize that, okay, I do recognize security interests on the one hand, but I also do recognize the right and respect for people's privacy, the right and respect for people's families, the right and respect. I mean, that's what America was built on, right? Or are we only talking about the Protestant landowner white families, right? That only those families are important, but everybody else's families aren't. Well, the idea is eventually, what will happen is you, the viewer, will recognize the totality of the threat that's posed to sovereignty and how that threat manifests itself as a threat posed back to the people. And if that's the relationship between the people and the sovereign, I'm a potential threat whether it's legitimate or not. And as such, since I'm perceived to be a threat whether it's legitimate or not, there are going to be hostilities projected towards individuals and collective communities, such that, as in the past, ethnical populations as large as Japanese Americans, which is pretty freaking big, are going to be herded in camps. Well, I mean, it'll be a sad, sad day. It'll be a sad day. So, it is tautologically true that if the nation state and its agencies can satisfy perceived needs in ways acknowledged by citizens, and I'll talk about the poll numbers and stuff, then its inhabitants become more nationalist. Okay, so to consolidate both points, right? The idea is simply the recognition that in terms of nationhood itself presupposes an obligation that the nation assumes, that the sovereigns assume, that our judiciary assumes, that our representatives assume in terms of the United States of America. It is an obligation they assume. To get in that position, you're assuming allegiance to the people. You're assuming an allegiance to the public. And if your interests aren't focused on the people, if your interests aren't focused on the public and protecting them, and if your interests are simply to abuse your authority egregiously because you have the power to do so, and for no other reason, then that becomes really problematic. So, quick side note, I'm watching Steven Universe with my kids. My kids are young. Great episode of Steven Universe. Sort of new cartoon. I didn't think it was going to be a good cartoon at first. I started watching, I was like, this is not too bad. So quick side note just to contextualize this, and then we'll move on. You can also Google it and watch the episode yourself. So shout out to the creative people at Steven Universe. Granted, it'll never be Adventure Time, but it's good. Shout out to Adventure Time. Steven has magic. He realizes that he can change his body into any shape. This is new to him, so he wants to morph into a cat. So Steven has the desire to change into a cat. And he wants to change into a cat, he wants to morph. I'm a shapeshifter, so I want to use the power that I have. It's the first time he's been exposed to his powers. And what does he do? He tries, it doesn't work. Bing! A little cat pops up on his finger. And he's entertained by the fact that he made a little cat on his finger. So he's willing more. Bing! Another cat. He's got all 10 fingers now that are cats. Now a cat pops up out of his neck, and a cat pops up out of his stomach, and his fingers, and his eyes, and he turns into this freaking monstrosity. It's a great episode. He turns into this horrible beast. I think that's a perfect analogy for the abuses of computer technologies by the government and its contractors. Just because you have the power to turn your finger into a cat or your body into a cat doesn't mean that you can just any time it crosses my mind, I can use that power any way that I want, because you will turn into a monster. You will turn into a monster, and the very same institution that allowed you to turn into a monster will eradicate you, because it'll be too terrifying for its people. And the best way to lose political power is to lose the will of the people. Once that's done, it's done. And slowly, that's what will happen. Until you recognize that, yeah, you have the power, but I'm going to use my power appropriately. I'm a professor at a university. I, alone, based on my decision, can either confer or defer or terminate someone's PhD. I'm a PhD chair for students. If I say their PhD doesn't meet muster, it doesn't meet muster. They don't graduate. Period. End of discussion. Nobody is going to usurp that power. The decision is mine and mine alone, along with my committee members. So you think I could just say, oh, well, you know what? I have this power now. Guess what? You spent $100,000 with Uncle Sam to get to the PhD level. We're just going to screw you over just for fun, just for kicks. I could do that anytime I wanted to. I really could do that anytime I want to. And I could create a masquerade and a show. And I could act like, oh, well, I'm not really screwing this person over, knowing that the person's doing good work, but I just want to screw the person over. Have I done that? No. Do I do that? No. Do I recognize that I could do that? Of course I know that I could do that, but I would never do that, because it would be an abuse of the power that I have, right? So that the idea is federal government in the United States of America, given all of its technological abilities, is going to tell us a story. But I'm not interested in the story that the government has to tell us. I'm interested in what happens with that power. Bob in Kansas, tell us your story of what happened. And Jason in Fort Lauderdale, tell us your story. And Mary in New York, and Tim in Texas, and Paula in freaking Cali. Tell me your stories, right? Eventually those stories build of injustice. Eventually those stories build of intrusion and invasion of privacy. And no matter how much love is professed, it's not about what's said, it's about what's done, period, at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, it's about love, it's about respect. And if that's not to be had, then what are we pledging as people allegiance to, right? We have to be careful for that. So it's important to understand, it's very, very important section for me, because, the past 9 sections, the past 14 hours was Yay USA. I do believe Yay USA, but I do also believe that the USA does some really, really horrible crap, and will likely do even more horrible crap, with no justification. I do recognize that there are some things that need to be done, and there are justifications for it, but, with no justification, and especially when it comes to its own interests, its own people. That's the real test. That's the real test of how power is going to be exercised. My students respect me. I would say my students love me for any number of reasons that I know, precisely because my students see how much I give to them, see how hard I work for them. It's not what I say that has bonded my allegiance with my students as tight as it has, and it's really tight. My evaluations are stellar. My relationships with my classes are stellar. As soon as my classes go up, they're populated in days. And this is not to brag, right? This is not to brag at all. That's not the intent. The intent is, it's not because I'm so exceptional, it's because they recognize what I do for them. That my interest is to serve them. That my identity is to serve them. And they respect that. If that's not the case, if it's always the case that there's a potential threat, and this is how we're going to exercise our power, well, you can imagine that it's going to cause substantial problems. Okay, clearly I'm going to end up breaking this into a few parts. I didn't think this section was going to be as long as it is, but it's good so far, so let's continue. Let me wipe down my board. Alright, so understanding the threats to national integration So we're going to understand the threats to national integration. Understanding the threats to national integration. 1. Social relationships capable of satisfying perceived needs. Social relationships capable of satisfying perceived needs. The nation not only has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, which I'll talk about in a second, etc., it also has a monopoly on the satisfaction of needs. So, understanding the threats to national integration. The idea is we want a more perfect, I think President Obama said something like a more perfect union. I think that's his phrase, which is just freaking awesome, right? A more perfect union. Not perfect, not perfection, because we can't attain perfection, but a more perfect union. A better union than we previously had. A more inclusive union. A more feasibly sustainable union. So the idea is we can't arrive at this quote-unquote more perfect union without a recognition that needs need to be satisfied. People's livelihoods need to be cared for within an acceptable degree. Right? And there's a debate between conservatives what that, and now I'm talking specifically, let's say, about food subsidies and welfare, right? What that acceptable level might be. But social relationships, those capable of satisfying perceived needs, these needs are, and I put perceived, it's not in quotes, it's in italics. The idea of perception is important. In the debate on food subsidies and food stamps in the United States that we've been having for a few months now, it's difficult. It's really a difficult, I'm not good enough in the legislation to really speak on the topic, though I'm very, very interested in how this develops. But the idea is we find ourselves in an economic crisis. We recognize that food subsidies account for, I don't know, X number of millions or billions of dollars from our spending. And the idea is we could save some of that money if we limit the amount of subsidies, right? If we limit the amount of money that we're going to allocate towards those people who need subsidization for their food, right? And just to think about the fact that you need to have your food subsidized is, I mean, you're already, you think about the position that you're in, right? You need the government in order to facilitate your own needs to eat. There's no shame in saying this. There was a huge shame when I was young, but this is atonement for when I was younger and more naive. Part of this lecture series is part of all of this is social good to give back. But the idea is when I was young, I was about 12, 13, 14, something like that. Mother with 6 kids at 27 years old, all from the same father, and he leaves us, he abandons us. Mom pulled herself up by the bootstraps, did the work, but no matter what she did, you're talking about 7 mouths you have to feed. She goes to Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam feeds us, right? Wow, that's cool. When I was in college, when I was in graduate school, I had 2 infant children. My wife was in graduate school. I'm in graduate school. We have 2 infant kids. Oh my goodness, you can imagine how hard it was. Full-time school, no time for work. You do, work studies, work in the library, do some, Uncle Sam, hey, we need subsidization. The idea is, yes, there are people who exploit the system, and there has to be mechanisms in place to secure those needs. But if those needs aren't acknowledged and met, you prevent people from participating in that union. The union isn't going to be perfect, right? Everybody isn't going to have all the flashy things. Everyone's not going to live the best, quote-unquote, moral lifestyle, whatever that means. But the idea is we, the people, and our representatives and our leaders are bonded by the concept that is America, or the concept that is your country, right? We're bound by that. And we need to make sure that, as the saying goes, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So the chain is the nation. And in terms of the integration of identity into the nation, the nation, is only as strong as our weakest link, such that if we exclude members from that inclusive, more perfect union, right? If we are systematically excluding large segments of the population because of poverty, A large, and a quick shout out, I'm not Catholic, but you gotta give a shout out to the Pope. What is not to love about this guy? I mean, he'll make somebody want to become Catholic. Seriously. Which would be huge, but I mean, shout out to the Pope, right? The idea is, you know, in this era, I don't know why, but there's I mean, the stigma has always been there about being poor. It's always been there. It's been there from the beginning of time. But it's perversely acute now. It's just, it's the new sort of like the previous era, like 19th century, 20th century era, ethnical identification of a particular type, to say that you were a Jew, or to say that you were a gypsy, or to say that you were African of some kind. Oh, well, that was the real stigma, right? To be a Jew was the worst thing to be, right? To be a gypsy is the worst thing to be. I think now it's, to the world collectively, the United States of America specifically, I live here, poverty is looked at as like a pariah. It's the disease, it's the new leprosy, right? And that's a shame. That's a shame, because I came from poverty. My mom made, I don't know, $19,000 until I graduated and left for college. We never knew money. And now I'm in a position, because I've done well financially for myself and my family because of my education, that I'm giving back so much. You wouldn't be able to have this. You couldn't even watch these videos. There would be none of this without Uncle Sam cutting a check so I can grab some food, right? So that I could eat when I was younger. I could have probably turned to the streets if I never had that. Right? So that the idea is, you know, this is one manifestation of the benefit and I don't want to go food subsidization specifically, but it addresses the point perfectly, right? Because the social need, the perceived need, I would say it's an actual need. I wouldn't say it's perceived, but there's debate on how much is right and such and such. The idea is it might take 20 years to see the benefit of that investment. I'm here to tell you firsthand as a personal story that this is a benefit. What you are getting right now, the globe over, is a benefit of my government at that time investing in my family, my mom, and myself by providing food for us. Specifically, something as simple as that. And I am motivated not just because, oh, well, you know, Jason, no, he's over the top with it. It's a bit of an exaggeration. It's hyperbolic. It is absolutely not hyperbolic. For me specifically, more than just the actual sustenance, more than the food, it was a recognition of not what was said, but what was done. And I respect that. I respect what was done. And this is an effort. And I mean this, right? And people who know me, my students who know me, know the story. I'm not going to get on my story publicly. But this is an effort to pay homage to what I saw done, not what was said. Now, granted, you know, relationships change. You meet someone at the ball. Oh my goodness, wow, they look cute. Let's talk. It's always happy-go-lucky initially. Then you really get into the relationship and you get to see what your partner's really like. So I can't say that relationships remain the same, that it's so wide-eyed and idealistic. But the truth of the matter is all of this work, and it's quite a bit of work that I've been doing and I will continue to do, is in respect for those initial contributions. So it's important to recognize that undermining those social nets, those safeties to protect people, threaten integration. It threatens the ability for the potential Jason 2.0 to make academic contributions in the year 2030 or 2040 because we didn't invest in him or her now. As I said, the payback for the investment in me took 20 plus years, but it's a pretty significant contribution. You know, I recognize, I don't need to be acknowledged. I recognize how much work I put out. I go through and I look at all the playlists and I look at all the hundreds of hours of lectures that I've given, and I'm telling you that that is 100% a direct consequence of that small display of really mercy, right? That small display of charity. It yields tenfold. It yields tenfold. Similarly, disrespect, negligence, intrusion, invasion of privacy, that also has ramifications, right? And those ramifications will also be probably 20-fold because we're talking about collective ramifications, right? So it's important. The next, another problem with integration, you know, if you undermine social nets in order to help those who have the most difficult time helping themselves, for example, food subsidies and such, well, that prevents integration. But there's also a sense where people refuse to be integrated, and this is the secessionist argument. Now, to be honest with you, I understand the various secessionist movements anywhere in the world, here in the United States as well. I get it. I understand the secessionist movement. It's primarily based almost exclusively on what is perceived to be overtaxation, justly or not, and sort of a hybridization of an infraction of liberties and privacy, and it's sort of that, so the hodgepodge of these ideas. I'm not going to go into my own sort of explanation on why I think some of these thoughts might be erroneous, because it's not fair to do that. It's not fair. So, to be charitable to any number of secessionist ideologies or secessionist movements, the idea is the state, the government, the nation isn't providing what the initial social contract set as a provision. And that was security or what have you, liberty, freedom, So is there justification in seceding? Sure, there's justification in seceding, no problem, right? The manner of secession, if it's going to be effective, all of that is going to factor into it. But the question is there sort of conceptual justification? Of course there's conceptual justification, fine. The idea, though, is secession by definition is a refusal to integrate. I mean, by definition. And the question then becomes, are there conditions that could potentially be met in order to satisfy those original provisions under the original social contract? Could the federal government of any government say to secessionist movements, hey, let's sit down at a table, let's negotiate something. We see that, you know, your numbers are growing, we see you, we hear you. What is it that you really want? What are your demands? Right? If they're cogent, sensible demands, then there's an opportunity for the nation to satisfy those demands and then incorporate what would otherwise be secessionists back into the nation. And I personally think that's the best move. Given the context of the nation, but in the United States of America, I think that's the best move. If it is, however, and so I'm giving both sides, I'm being objective here, I'm being fair. If, however, it's that the demands are just ridiculous, like no taxation at all, well, I mean, clearly that's laughable. That's not going to work, right? That will never work. Why? Because to be in power means that you need to pool your resources, means you need to tax. So any secessionists that were to have seceded, even in a theoretical abstraction, hyperbolic even, arrive at usurping existing political power, they would find themselves in a position to have to implement taxes in order to pave the roads and put kids in school and pay the cops and pay the teachers and right? So I mean, that wouldn't be realistic. So the idea is there should be, I won't say there has to be, sometimes people are just adamant and conflict arises, obviously violence. But the idea should always be to find those means, find those channels with which we can better incentivize cooperation, in which we can better incentivize collaboration and collaborative efforts. Secessionists have a point. Their point should be acknowledged. And where possible and where practical, those demands that they espouse should be addressed and possibly met. Where those demands are completely impractical and completely illogical, it should be demonstrated, and if there's a continued sort of disagreement, then, you know, what happens in terms of conflict. But you can see that national integration can be thwarted by secessionist ideologies. I do believe that, you know, via negotiation strategies and such, they can be sort of folded back into, they can be reabsorbed back into the fold. What's a little bit more difficult to do, to be honest with you, for me, is less about the secessionists and more about number one, which is sort of arguments and discussions on social welfare, social good, social nets, social services. All of these things have direct impact on the lives of the citizenry, and if it's, you know, if the state can't satisfy the needs of the basic needs of its people, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is, aside from security, why else is the nation in power, right? It's important to make sure that we address that. Number 3, ethnical incommensurability. This isn't really going to be the case in the United States per se, but so I'll be brief on this section. Hutu Tutsi, ethnical generational conflict. I've published and written on this topic. So you'll look at Burundi, you'll look at Rwanda, you'll look at potential conflict now in the Congo. There is incommensurability, a deep-seated hatred between these ethnical groups for any number of historical reasons, but there is a deep-seated hatred among the groups collectively, not individually, right? Collectively, and this is manifested time and time again in violence to the level of genocidal levels. Obviously, that inherent ethnical conflict between two massive groups, it's going to be impossible to form a more perfect union if parts of the potential union are so at odds with each other that they're historically killing each other en masse. It's impossible to incorporate these identities into a national identity, and these identities being ethnical identities. It's impossible to incorporate these ethnical identities into national identity if the level of their hostility, the level of their conflict has reached that magnitude, right? If it becomes that significant, it is problematic for sure. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4, disparate socioeconomic divisions. This might be the easiest of the 4 to resolve, right? Because I do believe things are cyclical. So we'll have a cycle of depression and recession, but that cycle of depression and recession reached its peak, its apex, whether justly or not, from about 80 to about 2000. You had about 20 years of boom, huge boom. So the idea is, I'm less pessimistic in this regard. I do believe, when I'm much older, when I'm maybe in my 50s or late 50s, early 60s, the United States might rebound and we might be in our boom years. I hope it doesn't take that long. It'll be good for my kids though. But I do believe that in terms of the socioeconomic disparity within this nation, other nations it's more egregious, right? The distinction in Jamaica, where I was born, is really bad. There's almost no middle class. It's expansive, pervasive poverty and affluence. A lot of South America is like that. Expansive, pervasive poverty and affluence. Very, very, very thin middle class. It's important to bolster middle class, This is one of the reasons that I don't go into politics and I have no interest in it, though I'm completely fascinated by it, because the job's a hard job. It's easy to talk about, strengthening and I don't go into it because it's hard. It's just the type of job. It's not the work function that I like doing. But the idea is we have a need for it, right? We need to figure out how do we really credibly protect the quote-unquote American middle class now, right? The reason why I put it in quotes is because I don't really know what that means anymore. It was clearly defined before. We have an understanding of what it is now, but it's changing, right? It's changing. What it is to be middle class is changing. What it feels like to be middle class is changing. We can't just talk about how much money you're making, middle class families or families that make this number to this number, because that money is associated with a feeling. It's not just about the numbers. If your standard of living, your cost of living, gas, all of that stuff rises, if medical insurance is progressively going up and up and up and up and up every single year, but you have the same amount of money, well, that money doesn't feel like it used to feel, because you used to get a lot more for your dollar than you do now. So it can't just be, middle class is this number to that number. I mean, that's obviously too generalized, right? To say middle class is just, you have this money to this money. A middle class is a feeling associated with that amount of money. It's a feeling of, sort of discretionary expendable cash. It's a feeling of community. It's a feeling of what you can do for yourself, for your family. It's a feeling of the possibility and a belief in upward mobilization. It's a feeling in that, right? It's confidence. And it's bizarre. It's probably the most bizarre phenomenon of the market, and it's very real. You can see this. Now this is more of the stuff that I'm interested in. But the consumer confidence, how that affects trading, how that affects money, how that affects so much is amazing to me, because it's very, very real. If you have a depressed, not in terms of economically, but almost to anthropomorphize the economy and say that your economy is going through depression, sadness, if you have lack of confidence, if you have lack of belief, lack of trust, people aren't going to spend much, and the bit that they do spend is not going to cycle its way throughout the economy, right? It'd just be on sort of sustenance of food and the basics, right? If that money is there, and that money doesn't have the same value that it has, and there isn't a confidence that I can spend a little bit today because, you know next check I'll be able to make up what I spent. If that's not there, and it's like banks are hoarding their money because they don't want to invest, people are hoarding their money because they don't want to take a chance, well, you can see the lack of confidence in the economy is going to prevent more growth. It's going to prevent us from getting to a new boom. It's important that people do have confidence in that. Now, I recognize that a lot of this has to do with educational accessibility, which is why I think education is so important. But in terms of that economic division, right, those socioeconomic divisions, there are many ways to do this. For me, still, and I believe this, and I am going to be a bit of a propagandist on this point, is that education is really the bridge, right? Education is the bridge with which you pull yourself up out of a depressed socioeconomic state. I recognize that people have full-time jobs. I recognize people have kids, and people have mortgages, and people have things that they're doing. But any little bit of training that you can get, and it doesn't have to be a 4-year degree, and it doesn't have to be a PhD or an MD or a Psych D, what have you. You can go to a community college and get technical training. There's nothing wrong with that. Learn how to program code and make 4 times the amount of money that I'm making, right? Off of 2 years worth of education. That possibility exists. But as those divisions, those socioeconomic divisions widen, that 1% seems more elusive than it has ever seemed. And to even have sort of 1%, 99%, we have this in our culture now. It has meaning. And it means more than just having money. It's an exclusion of all of us from that. It becomes problematic, right? Then we don't have clear union. What we have is 1% and 99%. We have division and a preservation of that division. And it's a difficult problem to solve. It's a very, very difficult problem to solve. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause at this point, and then we will pick up with binary and segmentary ideological substrates. So I'm going to pause now and then come back. Okay, so binary, sort of the distinction between binary and segmentary ideological substrates. So I'll just put binary and seg. I want to write all that stuff. So binary and segmentary ideological substrates. The ethnical kinship basis for identity and identity basis conflict. A segmentary ideological substrate. So I've talked about this in my international war videos. So if you click the link, it'll take you, I think I linked the specific section that talks about this. So just click the link if you want, pause it, click the link, watch it. It's probably like maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Watch that segment of the video. It might be a series of those videos, and I don't know how long it could be. It could be an hour, who knows. But you'll have a more complex understanding. I'm not going to go into the full analysis of what this sort of segmentary ideological substrate is. It's rather technical stuff. Even in my international war video, I don't get into it that much. I will be writing on this in 2014, though, sort of this ideological substrate. And it's not something that I've sort of come up with. It's there in the literature. So I'm going to give you a really, really, really general account now, just to get your palate wet. You have an idea of what it means, sort of the distinction between binary ideological substrates and segmentary ideological substrates. It's really not that difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to consolidate 22 and 20 and the image on 23. So just flip over to page 23, like right now, and just explain it, and then I'll go back through and read it. So the idea is we have segmentation. So we can imagine that this is ethnical population A, this is ethnical population B, this is ethnical population C and such, right? And that we have relationships between inter-ethnic, right? So that each of these, so this is a state, right? This is a state, or the nation. And this is the inter-ethnic relations. And these are inter-ethnic relations, the relationship between B and C, the relationship between A and B and such. And this all is taking place within the nation. Remember what we said just a few minutes ago, that one problem for the integration of identity within the nation, ethnical identity within the nation, is a consequence of existing inter-ethnical conflicts. So the example that I gave were Hutu and Tutsi. Obviously, it's hard to define and preserve national sovereignty. It's hard to define and preserve national identity if huge constituents of your national community are actively killing each other. It undermines the safety and the security, the stability, and thus the nation crumbles. Not to mention all of the socioeconomic problems, right? You can't preserve society, right? The idea of preserving social identity is really, really difficult when there's always blood on the streets. It's almost impossible. It's impossible to foster capitalism in the midst of exorbitant amounts of violence. People aren't going to go out to shop to get stuff if they don't have at least the belief that they're safe, right? So, I mean, capitalism is built on security. It's built on safety. This is partly the reason why, just quick side note, you go into the mall and you go shopping, they have all that crazy elevator music, is because they want it to be peaceful. They want it to be as peaceful as possible so that you have the opportunity to browse and purchase what you want. If you're thinking someone might pop out and start shooting at us, and it's realized, and that is a legitimate threat, you're going to be disinclined to go shopping, right? So that the idea is the relationship between ethnicities, and I'm contextualizing it because it's contextualized in the text. The interrelationship between ethnicities here in the United States, I would say it's more gangs, right? It's probably more gangs, if not exclusively gangs, rather than sort of ethnicities. Ethnical conflict defines much of the world's intra-state conflict. Within the United States, a lot of our intra-state conflict is unfortunately a consequence of gang warfare, which I don't think gets the amount of national attention it probably needs to get. It's a pariah. It's as bad as it can possibly be. But the idea is it's not so bad that it undermines the social nexus. It doesn't undermine sort of economic abilities and such. So it's intergroup. You can imagine one gang fighting another gang, one ethnical population fighting another ethnical population. Now, the idea is if those levels of violence can be contained, right, so that they are within an acceptable threshold, well, it doesn't undermine national identity, right? National identity isn't undermined by gang warfare. National identity isn't undermined by religious warfare in some groups, right? National identity isn't undermined by ethnical conflict. In terms of this ideological substrate, we recognize that there are going to be segments of the society, segment A, segment B, segment C, representing a gang or representing an ethnical group. Not to say that ethnicities are like gangs. That's not the analogy I'm trying to draw, and you shouldn't make that distinction. So I want to sort of compartmentalize identity. So in terms of ethnical conflicts, as long as those ethnical conflicts are within a certain acceptable range of violence, it doesn't provide any problem for the nation. Now, think about that. If you can understand that, you can go a step higher, and you can think about, because this should be clear now, I wanted to establish sort of a foundation. You can imagine the interrelationships between nations, such that nation A, rather than gang A or ethnic, and I'm not saying that the nation is a gang, but the idea is the interests are the same, right? Preserving our turf, preserving our region, preserving our land. You want to preserve your turf and your land, and there are problems when we go on your land and your turf and use your resources. And there are problems if you come on our land and our turf and destroy our infrastructure. And this is sort of, at a macro level, at an international level, the same concept, right? So that there is a series of interrelations also that nations have. And this should be obvious. I mean, everybody should be able to see this, right? And this is the most general, the most basic, as I said. I'm not going to go deep into this because a lot of this is sort of a given. All right, so I think that should be clear. Well, before I go into that, then we have, so this would be segmentary. And the idea is that any node, any individual node, is connected to any other node via nexus, via economic relations. If we're talking at a national level, primarily via trade agreements and tariffs, right? That's how nations do business, okay? You do business with me, we'll give you a break on the exportation and the importation of your blah, blah, blah. We'll do this, you'll make money, we'll make money, your people will be fine, our people, this happens all the time, right? This is like every day, this is common. In terms of security, we recognize that nations collaborate in order to facilitate dual, multiple levels, sometimes much larger than dual security interests. My security interests are your security interests, and I'm going to invest my security personnel and such to the preservation of your interests as well, because your security means my security. You can see how issues of reciprocity would be incorporated within sort of global, independent national interests. All segmentary. In terms of this binary division, you can see that there is a possibility to have a nemesis. And I don't mean it to sound as sort of comical, in a sense, I don't. But this really is sort of the idea that the nation defines itself in opposition to that other territory, right? That other nation, that other group. A more binary understanding. So instead of it being A and B, it would be A and not A. And they would say the same, we're A and you're not A, right? It's not that you're a different group, it's that we are not you. We define ourselves in opposition to you. We define our moralities in opposition to your moralities. We define our legal code, our familial structures, our political structures. Everything that you stand for, we stand against. You can imagine, and granted, this is macro level generalizable, right? Whether or not this actually exists in reality is less important. The idea is to posit polemics and then via practice and historical analysis fill in the polemics with gradations and a spectrum so that we have one extreme and another, and reality is somewhere in the middle. The idea is to have a conceptual understanding of what those extremes might be. So now I'll read at the top of page 22. This binary ideological structure is based heavily on Carl Schmitt, his concept of what he calls the friend-enemy. So this is Schmitt's conceptual term, the friend-enemy. And here's an explanation, right? The binary opposition is based in, and this is a direct quote, and this is from Schmitt, the binary opposition is based in, quote, the specific political distinction, which is important, the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is based between friend and enemy. So any specific distinction in political action can be reduced to friend or enemy. Granted, this is a huge generalization. It requires substantial, and this is why a lot of people don't sort of accept Schmitt's account, but it is an account, and it is a well sort of justified account. Whether it's actual or not is a different story. The idea is to articulate what it is. So a lot of the distinctiveness of political identity can be reduced to friend and enemy, who need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly, but he is nevertheless the other, the stranger. And it is sufficient for his nature that he is existentially something different and alien. Okay, what in the world does that mean? There is, and I don't have it, there's an amazing quote that I use time and time again from Arendt in Totalitarianism, I think it's in that book, where she talks about the Bolshevik purge. And the state says to the ethnical population, look, we know that you guys aren't necessarily the bad guys. This is the vibe. We know that you guys aren't the bad guys. We know you're just regular people. We know you're trying to live your regular lives. Think about how ominous this is. But as you know, the state's in power to protect people from bad guys. The state's in power to protect people from threats. So, despite the fact that we know that you're really not a threat, we're going to ask that you play the part of a threat. Right? You're going to have to play the role of a bad guy. And unfortunately, the role that you're going to play, we're going to punish you as if you were really the bad guy. We're going to seek you down, we're going to hunt you down, we're going to kill you and imprison you. But don't feel that this is a bad thing. View it as your contribution to the state. View it as an obligation that you have to preserve national identity, because, as we know in the end, the nation needs something to fight. Unfortunately, we've chosen you. Oh man, yikes. That's the extreme, right? You just fabricated a boogeyman in order to fight the boogeyman, which will collectively incentivize national identity, right? This is, you do theoretical research enough, you get to this point, right? And this is where you kind of understand, it kind of makes sense, but it's just so wrong. It's so wrong on so many levels. Why? Because the assumption is, or the presumption is, that the state, and this is why people have a problem with Schmidt, the presumption is that the nation and its identity and the preservation and fortification of its identity is contingent on a clearly articulated enemy. Here's our friends, but it's an enemy. We are not those people, and they're saying the same about themselves to us. We are not those people, and as such, we have socialized our people to revile those people. We've socialized our people to recognize our moral code and not their moral code. Their morality is debased. Our morality is virtuous. And you can imagine how, yes, this will preserve national identity, there's no question about it. It will galvanize a population to cheer for their team, to root for their team, sort of herd mentality. This happens all the time. People will become apathetic to the plight and the abuses of others. That's sort of pedestrian. All of this has been accounted for really for centuries. I mean, scholars have been writing about this literally for centuries now. So there's nothing new there. What's new, however, in terms of this idea to brand your identity, is the assumption that national identity is only possible, right? What's new is it's only possible in relationship to this enemy. Now, in a 21st century application, the question is, how might that apply? To take the lecture now, this theoretical sort of abstraction, practically, how might this apply? A lot of it has to do with practices between, religious practices between the East and the West. In terms of the East, the practice might be Islam. And in terms of the West, the religious practice might be Christianity. And the idea could be, though I don't believe that this is the case, right? Though who knows what the truth of the matter is. The idea could be that it's Christianity versus Islam. That Islam is not Christian, Christianity is not Islam. The truth of the matter, we all know it's Abrahamic, so we, and I say we in terms of nation, not in terms of religious belief, but we, the East and the West, both are religious sort of distinctions and basis for belief in morals and culture and society and politics and basically everything, are divergent, but they have a seminal starting point, right? It's all Abrahamic, right? It's the three monotheistic religions all have the same source. It's distinctions in identifications of prophets and such and nuance, blah, 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 that sort of parse us into segments. But the truth of the matter is, all the nations that have built themselves to the powers that they are, which is no surprise. I mean, I'm not saying anything new here. I'm really not. The one thing that I am saying that might not have been articulated clearly, I know other authors have, but I mean at least publicly in a lecture, to this level of sort of simplicity, is the assumption that it's Christians versus Muslims. That Islam and Western ideals are completely incompatible. And that might be true. I don't know if it is or is not. I'm not versed. Right? So if it is the case that Islamic beliefs, Islamic practices are incompatible with Western culture, that could be a huge incompatibility problem. Right? There might be some incommensurability there. So if there is, incompatibility, if there is, and I don't know that there is, and similarly, not just to say that, if it's the case that Western culture is also incompatible, sort of to be reciprocal in this regard, if it is the case that Western culture and Western practices are absolutely incompatible with Islamic thought and Islamic systems of belief, then it puts the burden, it puts the obligation on interfaith dialogues more than ever. If we're to live hospitably over there, over here, over wherever, the idea is we are going to have to cohabitate. Cohabitation is not an option, right? Because the argument is this binary division between us and them, or them and us, what have you, us and them, you inverse it. This binary division will fortify sort of national identity. It creates a clearly defined threat. However, it erodes the possibility. It destroys the possibility of, I guess, quote-unquote, a more perfect union. But now we're talking about a union of nations, not a union of individuals within the nation, right? It makes international interdependence that much more difficult, that much more complicated, if it's just acknowledged that, listen, Islam is completely incompatible with Western culture. Western culture is completely incompatible with Islam. Therefore, we're never going to see eye to eye. I don't know enough about religious practices on either side, Christian or Islam. I don't know enough about religious practices to be able to comment on that. But I do know that interfaith dialogues are, I know what they are, and I know that they're important. Why? Because there are instances in which Christians and Muslims get along, marry, intermarry, have children, right? Again, I don't want to go too far into the religion because I really don't know enough of the theology to be able to comment on it, but interfaith dialogues at an international level, negotiations and interfaith discussions at an international, not just an interpersonal NGO level, but as a formalized process of governance becomes that much more important. Because otherwise, this systemic binary opposition, it's a winner-takes-all position from a negotiation strategy. Once you assume a binary opposition, once you assume this friend-enemy distinction, demarcation, it's winner-takes-all. So someone's going to lose. And the idea is no one has any guarantees that our team's going to win. You have no guarantee that your team's going to win. We have no guarantee that our team's going to win. So one of us is going to lose. And of course, we don't want it to be us and you don't want it to be you, whoever we and us is. The idea is to circumvent that winner takes all. We can have a more shared collectivist approach, a more pluralistic global approach, a much more difficult to implement approach. Pluralism is not easy, ethnically and definitely not nationally. I think it's even far more difficult nationally than it is ethnically. But pluralism is very difficult to manifest in reality as practice. But interfaith dialogues, interfaith discussion can be a way in which even if we cannot reconcile some of these differences and they remain incommensurable, at least we can have respect for, which is hard, right? Having respect, but at least we can have respect for other people's difference in lifestyle and difference in practice and beliefs and morals and such, right? So that it doesn't have to degrade and devolve into violence. Okay, so that should be clear. So next, middle of page 23. First and third world conflict may potentially be lessened by a first world conceptual identification with third world ethnical groups, rather than tribal identification, since ethnical groups are represented in the first world. So the idea is how do we make, in terms of national identification, one thing that we can do is we can recognize that identification, and this is two extremes, there's many more. We can, and neither is good or bad, but we can identify in a more binary oppositional way. And I think there are problems with, ideological problems with putting all chips on sort of antithetical binary opposition, right? In terms of morality, in terms of religion, Christians versus Muslims, Western tradition versus Eastern culture, you know, there's huge oppositions there. Some of that might actually be, it might not be capable of reconciling some of those distinctions. Thus, the likelihood for international conflict is bolstered by this incrementality. On the other hand, we have sort of a segmentary identification, right? This preserves national, and they're again, super general stuff. There are new conceptual tools that have been developed and discovered over the years since the when was this published? This is like, publications a bit. This was published, I don't have the date. 91. So yeah, there are quite a number of conceptual tools that have been developed since this. I don't want to go into any of them now because what I wanted to pinpoint was really sort of the seminal, I wouldn't say that this piece is seminal, it's a great piece, but the seminal concept for which we conceptualize the polemics. It's either us versus them, or it's us working with others and recognizing shared allies. That segmentary concept, it has now evolved past that into what I would say is interdependent, right? So that segmentary ideological substrates have now evolved into international interdependence, and it hasn't crystallized by any sense. I mean, we just started the 21st century. We're a decade plus into it, so fledgling century. If you think about it, it's 100 years. It's a fledgling century. But the idea is, as the months go by, as the years go by, as historical relations change, as nations and national identifications change, I would argue it, and this is an ethical claim, and I'm not going to justify it now, it should be, I think Schmitt did a great thing by articulating this binary opposition. I think it's dangerous if all of your national identity is preserved in fortifying binary opposition, especially in a globalized era. But it's important that we have that understanding conceptually. We have one end of the pole. The other end of the pole is not going to be kumbaya, everybody's interrelated and we all share resources and share wealth and share citizenry. And I mean, that's also one end of the spectrum. Us versus them, all of us together. Two polemics. It's important to recognize the polemics because then we can see that actual national identification of any nation is somewhere in between. I would like it a little bit, for you this is left, I would like it a little left of center, and I don't mean that in conservative or that terms, just left of where I'm standing right now for you. Right? So a little left of center. I would like it to move a little bit more towards an interdependency than the preservation of binary oppositions. The old era, Cold War era, manifested in preservations of binary oppositions. It worked well in the Cold War. It really did work well. It worked amazingly well. I think that's an anomaly. I think it's an anomaly never to happen again ever. It was, I don't know why it turned out the way that it did, meaning that both sides recognized the shared ability to annihilate everybody. People comported themselves, they accorded themselves, they shifted towards reason, they thought rationally, and said, hey, I wrote the code, CPE 1704 TKS, War Games, right? War Games, the movie, ends with everybody with that recognition that we all lose if we play that game. There are no winners in that game, and that gave the 80s, despite any bad that progressivists say about Reagan, right, in terms of his economic policies and what he did economically, he gets top marks for subverting international war. I mean, you got to give him props for that. It's undeniable, right? The poise, the self-restraint, and that's what I think is lacking now in contemporary American government, is that poise, is that self-restraint. The ability to know that you could annihilate and decimate an entire other population of people, ideologically diverse, ideologically distinct from our population, and they're saying the same. And yet you have the poise and you have the reserve not to use that technology for those ends because you know rationally that it will undermine your own interests. I don't see that happening in my lifetime again. I think we are too impulsive a people now. I think we're too incredulous. I think we're too self-absorbed a people. You know, and I would love to be proven wrong. Proving me wrong would be right. Right? To prove me wrong would actually be the best thing to do. But I believe I'm right. I believe that amount of self-restraint was anomalous, never to be seen again. Because political establishments and political power have power, and with that power, what's the point of having a Ferrari if you can't flip it off the bridge? What's the point of having a Ferrari if you're not going to crash it, right? That's sort of the mentality now, right? It's sort of a very juvenile mentality. It's like we have toys and we're going to play with them. Unfortunately, time tells of what, history tells of what happens with those abuses, but it's important to recognize. It's important to recognize those tensions. So, in terms of the incorporation of first and third, I don't want to spend too much time in this because now my lecture has taken a step beyond my notes. So just read the notes on sort of the first world and the third world stuff. I don't want to go into that too much. It had to do more with socioeconomic abuses, third world laborers, first world groups, and identification with individuals based on ethnical identification, right? So that the first world should be able to empathize with individuals from the third world if we don't think about the socioeconomic differences, huge differences in poverty. We can empathize with third. I guess I will talk about this a little bit. I just don't want to get too deep into this because my interest sort of shifted real time. What for me is real time. What we can do to instill empathy is that within the United States of America, we are the repository for any number of ethnical groups. I would love to hear the statistical data on how many different ethnical populations live in the United States. I would love to see that. I might actually Google it out of curiosity. Hey, shout out to Bing. Let's just Bing it. I don't know. Bill Gates, your products, I've been using them for years. They're a little shaky, but you gotta love Microsoft. So maybe you Bing it. Maybe we Bing it. But the truth of the matter is the first thing that came to my head was Google it, right? So Google it, Bing it, do whatever you want to do. But the point of the matter is, it would be interesting to see the number of ethnical populations in the United States. I would imagine it's in the thousands. I can't imagine it's in the hundreds. It's got to be at least 1,000, if not more. Probably something ridiculous, like 5,000 or 10,000. The number is going to be ridiculous, right? But it would be interesting to know the number of ethnical populations in the United States. These ethnical populations migrate here and have kids here. Their kids and them can be natural born, or they can be naturalized citizens, right? So that the idea is we're supposed to love our citizens, we're supposed to respect our citizens. It seems as though then, on that account, we should be able to have empathic relationships with third world, quote unquote, people, because those third world people are identified ethnically. And they're the same ethnicity. A lot of these people, I know it sounds pejorative, a lot of these people, quote unquote, have ethnical ties to American citizens of exactly the same ethnicity. And these Americans of exactly the same ethnicity rise to power. They become the professors and the deans. They become the sergeants and the chiefs of police. They become holders of cabinet positions and governors and mayors and such. So that the idea is we can create a condition in which we can interact internationally at an interdependent sort of level, because at its root we can still sort of operationalize ethnical identity. Ethnical identity is still shared, and the argument might be now the inverse. Rather than looking as we did, and this is a bit more complicated, but rather than looking at as we did in the past as the citizens, the identification as citizen for one state, so that we have citizen as a collection of different ethnicities, so one citizenship conceptually, and then we have sort of any number of ethnical identities. What we can do now is we can look, which was the traditional model, I spent hours talking about that. What we can do now is look at the idea of a global citizen, not just a citizen for a state, but global citizenship, right? And what might that mean? What would that look like? And the idea that at a national level, our nation, so you have nation, different nations, despite the fact that we might not share the same national interests, we, different nations, all have ethnical communities, A, B, C, D, and such. And that members of our ethnical communities could be shared in different nations, so that we have a bridge that we can build. Right? We have bridges that we can build. So that the idea is which would create and facilitate and foster interdependent international relationships. So the idea is, in terms of 21st century political engagement at an international level, we could potentially facilitate a more inclusive international order, not by looking at citizenship, which has been the old paradigm, but by returning to ethnical identity in conjunction with citizenship, right? Because the idea is our citizens aren't your citizens. That can become problematic. Americans are not, nationality X. And this has led to a lot of isolationists. However, that ethnical subpopulation, those ethnical identities that we tried to move past in the last century, if we revisit them within this context, we can use ethnical identity now as a means of bridging interdependent international relations. Yeah, our citizens and your citizens aren't the same, granted. However, huge constituent members of my national population are of ethnicity A, and huge constituent populations of your citizens are of exactly the same ethnical identity A. Let's use that fact as a means of facilitating greater collaborative national efforts, so that the nation at an operational level operationalizes ethnical identity as a means of facilitating international interdependence, to be technical, right? It's a very nuanced bit, but the idea is the nation could conceivably operationalize ethnical identity, which had been sort of discarded as sort of cliched, but which I am arguing maybe we want to revisit in this new context of international interdependence. So again, I guess I did explain. I didn't think I was going to get into that much detail, but that's what I mean. So pro, an ability to see the third world other via ethnical lines similar to our own ethnical divisions, which is what I just said. Con, to selectively choose to identify ethnical rather than tribal identities institutionalizes the imposition of first world modes of identification throughout the world, right? So the idea is, and even then I think it could be incorporated. The idea being national identification and the preservation of nationhood, whatever the nation might be, wherever it might be, could be facilitated, could be bolstered by international, inter-ethnic movements to transcend national identification. It used to be the case that national identification transcended, this is what I lectured on before, national identification transcended ethnical identification. This was the first mode, and I talked a lot about that. Now what I'm saying is that it could be the case that ethnical identification could, once again, well, not once again, ethnical identification might now transcend ETH, right? Ethnical identification might now transcend national identification, and who knows, it might oscillate. But I am seeing a tendency, at least within the logical sequencing of events, that national identification has become problematic severely because of any number of factors, and that nation A and nation B might not be able to participate in international relations. Why? For any number of factors. How might we overcome the distinctions in our citizens and your citizens, our nation and your nation? We might be able to do that by returning to the thing that binds us. And the thing that binds us, that transcends our national identification and our citizenship, is that despite the fact that our citizens are citizen A and your citizens are citizen B, we share collectively in our nations ethnical populations of exactly the same type. Let's revisit that so that we can transcend the distinctions that we have nationally. So you never know. Now you have to be careful when you make this move, right? There's a ton of literature that preemptively should be written and should be done conceptualizing what I just put out there. Because I'm telling you, no one said this. and if they have, please correct me, but I haven't read this anywhere. What I'm talking about now, sort of the operationalization of ethnical identification as a means of bolstering national identification and national interdependence. I don't think anyone has said that. The idea is preemptively, we should, as social scientists, be conceptualizing problems that might arise from this. And you can understand, as soon as we go ethnical, it might then put too much emphasis on ethnical, and we could go back to the old school blood wars, right? Our ethnical population, this, what started out with good intent, what started out with as a means to bridge disparate populations of sort of nations, disparate nations, national communities, and a mean to reconcile some of that difference and distinctiveness by appeal to ethnicity, could give too much power to ethnicity, and we're back into the old blood wars, right? This ethnical population is pure because it facilitates the best bonds, and this ethnical population is not, So the idea is, my job is to sort of lay out the conceptual framework. I'm telling you, this little corny, simple image that I've drawn could account for the next 15, 20 years. And I'm not, again, this is not hubristic at all. It's just a fact that this could account for it. Sort of tracking this, the transition from ethnical to nationhood, quite a bit has been done describing this. The conceptualization of revisiting this, oh my goodness. I mean, tons of literature, tons of research. Eventually it works its way up. It reaches the critical mass, and now it becomes policy. And now people are making national decisions based on this idea. The idea is, given the fact that that could be the case, let's start as social scientists now publishing heavily on this, right? Incorporating inter-ethnical, interfaith-based dialogues as a means of bolstering and facilitating international interdependence. We need to be doing that now. We need to be conceptualizing that now. We need to be working out the kinks now. Because if we don't do this, if we're not able to point to the history and point to logic and point to reason and point to social context and theological context, then, and it makes its way to the sovereignty and decision makers. And we know, as academics, our writing does do that, and what we produce does make its way there. It's not hubristic at all, it's a fact. And it potentially influences decision-making capabilities. If we're not thinking about and talking about and publishing and writing on these topics, and it's operationalized before we've been able to work out some of the conceptual difficulties, well, you're going to work out the conceptual difficulties in the real world. And that could be really problematic. So the idea is to work out the problems now, work out the kinks now, so that we can circumvent any problems in its application in the real world, right? So I invite young scholars to, sort of publish heavily and write heavily, start talking about this, because I think this is going to be big. I think it's going to be really big. All right, so concerning, but I could be wrong, concerning the possibility of a nationalistic morality. It sounds pretty ominous, right? Concerning the, more ominous as the days go by. So number one, this is an important point. The attempt to subsume micro-level ethnical segmentary conflicts, right? The attempt to subsume micro-level ethnical segmentary conflicts at the national macro level becomes a moral act. So in parts of binary opposition or interdependence, we recognize we had, as I said, segmentary conflict has evolved into a more interdependent, a more holistic look. Rather than saying, oh, you're in gang A and I'm in gang B and we're going to fight over turf in a segmented concept, right? And I drew the picture, but it was like A, B, C, something like that. So in terms of inter-ethnical conflict, we've transformed the nature of the relationship, right? It's exactly the same relation. It's a perception of the relation that's changed. There's still a relationship between ethnical population A and B, A and C, B and C, B and A, and such. There's still that relationship. But rather than that relationship being defined in terms of segmentary conflict, where we are fighting others and others are fighting us, we've evolved that conflict into an interdependent. The relationship is still preserved, but it's the nature of the relationship, our interpretation. I'm not going to view that person as being hostile. I'm going to I'm going to collaborate with, I'm going to be willing to negotiate with the other. That leads us to a more interdependent. So we would have interdependent on one extreme, we would have segmented on another extreme, and then we would have binary on the end. And this isn't to say that this is totalizing, right? But it makes sense, right? The oppositional forces are binary opposition, where there's one group and another group, and they have antithetical relationships. The other end is where there are multiple groups and we have working relationships. And somewhere in the middle is a number, and there's more than this, right? You can think of any number of divisions. The idea is not to sort of flesh out every single and deconstruct every single possible relationship, as much as it is to realize that we can talk about what we ought to be doing, right? We can take that segmentary conflict, so the attempt to subsume micro-level ethnical segmentary conflict, right? And it becomes a moral lack. And subsume that with a more interdependent identity, right? With a recognition of interdependence. Now, this is easier said than done. If groups have been warring, conflictuary with each other for years, and any number of factors, any number of parties are on the table, I'm here to tell you this is easier said than done. We can write this in a little graph here, and I've written on this concept recently, earlier in the year. The more variables, the more parties, the more actors, the more agents there are in quote-unquote the game, the more difficult it becomes, right? Any of this can be destabilized at any time. Anybody can change parties, any affiliation can change, but the idea is to always think about sort of that moral obligation. We, as a nation, should be able to subsume the ethnical tensions nationally, right? So if there are existing ethnical identifications and those identifications are hostile, we should be able to take ethnical identifications that are hostile and subsume some of that nationally, right? A call to the nation, a call to national identity, which would at least appease or calm for maybe a little bit of time. No one is saying resolve, right? No one's that foolish. The ethnical segmentary conflict by identifying ourselves nationally. I then talked about another way of transcending this, but that's a different concept. Number two, inter-ethnic segmentary conflict. Inter-ethnic segmentary conflict typically occurs intra-state, which I discussed, which potentially weakens national interest. Thus, to strengthen national interest, there should either be an attempt to resolve or mediate inter-ethnic segmentary conflict, top of page 24, less likely and idealistic, or two, incentivize a more binary worldview. Okay. The other option that I didn't put there, I probably should have, would be interdependent, right? So a binary worldview has benefits because it does fortify national identification, but I think a lot of national identification is fortified at the consequence, at the expense of more collaborative, interdependent, pluralistic worldview. On the other hand, I think that from segmentary inter-ethnical conflict, which could potentially weaken intra-state, I-N-T-R-A, intra-state, the integrity of the state itself, and thus national identification, I think that what we can do, and this, again, I don't want to make it too complicated, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. I think what we can do is to identify more ourselves, try and construct. It's hard to even think about what that might feel like or what it might look like. We all know what it feels like to be part of your ethnical population, so to be black. I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to be black American. And I do know what it feels like to be American, right? So I have a feeling of what that might be. I don't know what it feels like to be sort of European. The European feel is a different feel, right? To be European is to be different, right? It means something different. I don't know that feeling. I understand. Well, I don't understand it. I can conceptualize it, but I don't know that feeling. So the idea is, as our national interdependence respectively become more intricate, our relationship with other nations become more than just socioeconomic, become more than just security-based relationships, but those relationships become part of identity formation. There will be a new existential, right, to be technical, there will be a new experience collectively of identity. We now identify as this new thing, which is far more complex. This exists already because you can think about sort of the European Union, right, and being sort of the European Union being the culmination of that original Alexandrian identity, really, to be honest with you. It sort of is the culmination of what Alexander the Great set out to accomplish, right? It's been done now. It's been realized now. It's been realized socioeconomically, it's been realized security-based, but it's also been realized in terms of identity. There is that identity. I don't understand that identity of Europe to be European, but we live in different nations. I don't know that lived experience. In the States, that could potentially be on the horizon, right? In the next, 50, 100 years, that sense of identity could be on the horizon with respect to our relationship with other nations, but that's all sort of hearsay at the moment, right? There would need to be a need for that and such, but the idea is at least we're not fighting, right? At least it's not conflictual. At least we're doing something constructive, and our people, our citizens respectively, are benefiting from this new, larger identification, which has proven to be fairly good, So with that, I want to end this section. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.